screen and welcome you all once again to our event. Our speaker today, Anne Deschamps, is going to speak with you, and I'll let you introduce yourself, Anne, and audio describe yourself and tell us who you are and what you want to share with us today.
Thank you so much, Connie. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Anne Deschamps. I am a middle-aged woman with little longer than shoulder length, dark brown hair, dangly earrings, a white top with a floral print and a gray sweater. And in the background, I have a poster of a cherry blossom. I am the director of the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center that's located at Transcend. And I am here today to talk to you about the ADA and how it affects people transitioning from secondary school to life after secondary school. So I'm going to take a minute and share my screen so I can start presenting. And then I want to move it to presentation mode here. There we go. Okay, is that working for everybody there? Can we see?
Yes.
It's on the screen. Okay, great. Thank you. Just need some reinforcement. Thanks, Vicki. So, as I said, I am from a nonprofit organization, Transcend. We are improving the lives of people with disabilities through meaningful work and community inclusion. The Mid-Atlantic ADA Center is a project of Transcend, and we're funded by the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research, otherwise known as NIDLR, which is part of the Administration for Community Living, which is part of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, which is part of our federal government. It's quite a mouthful. So I want to talk a little bit about what I am going to cover today. And on this slide, you see the agenda with a picture of George Bush Sr. signing the into law on the south lawn of the White House with Justin Dart and Evan Kemp on either side of him, and Sandra Perino behind him with the, and I am not remembering the name of the clergyman who also officiated that day. So I'm going to set the stage a little bit about why we're talking about the ADA and what it has to do with transitioning youth and make that connection. I'm going to emphasize the most important point, which if you don't take anything else away today, you take this most important point away. We'll get a little bit into the legislative mixing bowl, all the pieces of legislation that touch disability and how they affect transitioning youth, because that can be very confusing. And then we'll focus on reasonable accommodation, talking about disability in employment, preparing students, and how to prepare students and youth with disabilities. What kind of activities, if you're a transitioning youth, if you're a teacher, if you're a parent, if you're working directly with transitioning youth, what are some ideas and strategies and activities you can do to make that transition easier? Yes. Okay, I thought I heard somebody. Okay, so why talk about the ADA? And here we have a black and white picture of a group of people in wheelchairs, and there's a sign on the back of one of the wheelchairs that says, "We shall overcome," and they're in front of a state capitol there. So the Americans with Disabilities Act is civil rights law that was passed in 1990. We're going into our 31st year here. And incumbent in this comprehensive piece of civil rights legislation, there are provisions that affect education and employment, and also indirectly speak to the necessity of self-advocacy skills and the importance of self-advocacy skills. So that's why we entitled this Straight Talk, because the ADA is a really comprehensive piece of legislation, and we could spend hours and hours talking about it, but we're going to get right to the point and talk about just the parts of the ADA that affect transitioning youth. And then on this is slide number 5. And here it's entitled Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, 504, and the Americans with Disabilities Act. So when a youth with disabilities is in school, they are covered by the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And this used to be known as the Education for All Handicapped Children's Act, which was passed in 1975, that says that each child with a disability is entitled to a free and appropriate public education, just like every other child, in the least restrictive environment. So that is the one sentence summary of what the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act said. When that legislation passed, it established our special education system as we know it today in school. And so in order for the states and the local governments to secure the federal funds to pay for special education, they have to develop individualized education plans for each person with a disability. And again, this sets up our special education system. This is very, very different from Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act. These are civil rights laws. These are not entitlements. These are civil rights. And here is a quote from George Bush from the speech he gave when he signed the ADA into law. It says, the ADA will ensure that people with disabilities are given the basic guarantees for which they have worked so long and so hard: independence, freedom of choice, control of their lives, the opportunity to blend fully and equally into the rich mosaic of the American mainstream. I think sometimes when we talk about the ADA, we get so caught up in discussion about compliance that we lose sight of the fact that this is a civil rights law, and that this is the opportunity for all people with disabilities to bend fully and equally into the rich mosaic of American mainstream. On slide number 6, now, I'm going to pause every now and then and ask Vicki Landers to join me, because a lot of questions come up during this presentation and things can be confusing. So we're going to pause for a minute and have a little bit of discussion, because Vicki, over the years that I have been doing training and technical assistance on the Americans with Disabilities Act, and also supporting youth transitioning to life after school, lots of questions come up on the difference between the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act and the ADA in Section 504. And the first question is, are the definitions of disabilities different under each law? And the answer to that is they are. And then how does this affect transitioning students? Under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, disability categories are defined. I think if I remember correctly, there are 13 different categories of disability, and they're very specifically defined. Under the ADA, disability is not defined in this way, and we'll talk about the definition in a second. But I think it's really important to understand that there isn't the same definition of disability under IDEA as there is under the ADA. Now, as you think about legislation and stuff, did anything occur to you as far as questions for transitioning youth?
So I'm sorry, my camera for some reason has decided didn't want to work at the moment, but I'm working through that.
Oh, I can see you. I can.
Oh,
see
okay, good. Oh, good. For some reason, my screen does not. It's showing me that my camera is off, but
Well, I can see you. I'm
okay,
hoping everybody else can see you as well.
good. Zoom is always so much fun.
Yeah. Keeps us on our toes.
Yes, it does. So, I don't know enough about this, which is why I thought this conversation was so important. And I want people to learn to understand the differences, and how important each of them are, and how both of them can work for students.
And that is really well said. And the important thing is not that you understand all the details of the definition of disability under each law. I think it's the takeaway here is that you understand that while you're in school, if you are a child with a disability, you're covered by the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And you're also, the ADA also covers school in terms of accessibility, et cetera. But when it comes to your IEP, that all of that falls under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And the ADA is much broader. It's like IDEA is one small prong and the ADA is the umbrella. So the IDEA is a prong on the umbrella, and ADA covers all areas of life because it's civil rights legislation. So, someday somebody's going to have to draw a perfect picture to show how all the pieces of legislation relate to each other. I have not seen that yet, but so let me talk a little bit about the definition of disability under the ADA, and stick with me, Vicki, if you don't mind, because I want to know if any questions occur to you, because if they occur to you, they're going to be occurring to our audience members too.
Absolutely.
As I said, the definition of disability under IDEA has, I think, 13 specific categories. It's either 12 or 13 specific categories that name disabilities, like a learning disability, like they have a category called other health impaired. The definition of disability under the ADA does not. There is a formula that is set out, and this is the formula. It's based on the definition of disability in the Rehabilitation Act. And it's a person with a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, an individual who has a record of such an impairment, or an individual who is regarded as having such an impairment. So instead of saying that here's a list of disabilities that are considered disabilities under the ADA, they put forth a way to determine, regardless of the name of your condition, if it's a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, you're covered by the law. And sometimes people are discriminated against because of their record of a disability, or they're treated as though they have a disability when they really don't. And those two categories are much smaller, not nearly as broad as the first category. So do you see the difference between the definition of disability under IDEA and the definition of disability under under ADA and the Rehabilitation Act?
Absolutely.
Okay, because this is much more, the most important, the takeaway with the definition of disability is if you have an IEP and you have gone through special education, you want to look and make sure that you meet this particular, the ADA definition of disability. And most people who are covered by IDEA do meet the definition of disability under the ADA, but it isn't a foregone conclusion. Just because you have an IEP doesn't mean you're necessarily covered by the ADA. So you wanna work through that analysis and talk to your parents and your teachers to see if you meet that definition or not. Does
Okay.
that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Okay. Did you have any other questions before I dive right into talking about employment and work?
Like, I guess I want to learn a little more, just because I really am, you know, I have a child that grew up with an IEP. And so and honestly, even for me, this is a big learning experience. Just learning how all of this is defined and how much work there is that has been done to make the transition, you know, students with disabilities, it being different, changing it from I'm sorry, my brain is like all over the changing, like, you know, just because it says like the defining, you know, that you have a disability, which people are always, you know, there's always this big thing about like, oh, well, you're not actually disabled because it doesn't say it, you don't have paperwork that says you're disabled. And that's like, I think that's a good separation, I think, for me on like how the idea works. You know?
Yeah, no, it actually, I'm completely following you.
Okay.
Keep in mind, under the idea, that establishes a special education system, and it's all about funding and paperwork and setting up a system where youth with disabilities can be educated and receive an equal education to their non-disabled counterparts. So that's a lot about paperwork and establishing the system. ADA doesn't establish any system. ADA says, listen, fundamentally, our society, the good old US of A, America, has been developed, and there are so many barriers to the successful and equal participation of people with disabilities out there that we have to teach people how not to discriminate against people with disabilities. And so what this law does, the ADA does, is it sets forth concepts to teach all of us how to include people with disabilities. So it isn't about setting up a system for education. It isn't, you know, with a specific mandate. There's no entitlement here. It's about setting forth concepts to teach all of us how to include people with disabilities so that they can afford the same kind of life that everybody has. Is that a little bit clearer there?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So now, another good thing about the ADA, different titles address different aspects of life. And Title I, if we look at slide 8, addresses employment. And Title I says that covers qualified people with disabilities. And so we know what a person with a disability is. It's a person with a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, right? So the employment provisions say, hey, we only cover qualified people with disabilities. So this isn't a preferential treatment situation. This is the person with a disability has to be qualified for the job under which they're being considered. If they're not qualified, then, then they're not covered under this, this particular title of the law. So let's look at that. This is the definition. What you see on the slide is the definition of disability, and then a word cloud with employment and all these words related to employment. A qualified individual with the disability is one who satisfies the requisite skill, experience, education, and other job-related requirements of the employment position, and with or without a reasonable accommodation can perform the essential functions. So this is essentially saying a person with a disability has to be qualified to do the job, which makes a lot of sense. Employers don't have to consider people who aren't qualified to do the job. So we're going to transition now into talking a little bit about disclosure before we get into some of the concepts. So when you think about the employment provisions of the ADA, you also think when, and I get asked this quite a bit, Vicki, when do I disclose my disability, particularly by people who have non-apparent disabilities? You notice how I use the word non-apparent? I don't say hidden disabilities, because I personally don't like the word hidden. It's like we're trying to hide something. And as a person with lots of non-apparent disabilities, I think non-apparent is the better word to describe people with non-apparent disabilities. So you are not required to disclose your disability prior to beginning work. You can disclose it any time during your employment career. So the question is, when is the best time to disclose? And so when is the best time to talk about disability with my employer? Because there are a lot of transitioning youth out there who maybe don't feel comfortable or aren't prepared to talk about their disability with the employer, or don't want to for whatever reason. And, it is really critical for everybody, those of us who work with transitioning youth, who parent transitioning youth, who are transitioning youth, to be very, very clear. It is always your choice, whether you have a parent or non-apparent disability. It's always your choice when to talk about the disability or not. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. So I have one question for you.
Yes.
Okay, so it was like qualified,
Yes.
what that word always sticks to me, because some people don't, to me, it makes total sense, but for some folks, it may not. Like, just before we go forward on all of it.
Yeah.
What qualified under the ADA? What is that? Like, how does that,
How do they decide what's qualified and what's not? Well, they say specifically, the law says that a qualified person is somebody who can perform the essential functions of the job. And then it goes on to describe in detail what makes a job task essential. And it was interesting in the early 90s when I started talking about the ADA and doing trainings on the ADA. One of the things that a lot of people talked about was the importance of job descriptions, because job descriptions are where we all find out what are the essential functions of the job. So the only way to know whether you're qualified is to know what the essential functions of the job are. And so job descriptions became a focal point of discussion. And I think it made a lot of employers sit back and really look at their job descriptions to make sure that all the things in the job description were really talking about the essential functions. So they might have a section that says these are the essential functions and these are the marginal functions. So essential versus marginal.
Okay.
Because that's how you determine whether you're qualified. And, you know, and to put yourself out there for an interview, you want to believe that you're qualified. Well, you can ask the employer, you know, can I have a list of the essential functions of the job? And again, job descriptions aren't necessarily required. And if they have job descriptions, it's not necessarily required that they list out these are essential, these are marginal. However, 99.9% of the employers that I've talked to and trained believe it's in their best interest to have detailed, good, because they want qualified people, whether they're a person with a disability or not. And the only way to get qualified people is to tell people what you need and what's essential for the job.
Okay. Yeah, I find that a lot of folks, you know, they're like, well, you know, they won't give me this job because I'm disabled. And I try to explain to people that it probably has nothing to do with your disability. I'm not saying it may not, but the first thing you need to do is you need to look and make sure that you're qualified for the job, because, you know, I look at jobs all the time, you know, and the first thing that I do is I go through kind of what they have as like what you need to be able to do, what, you know, what things that are mandatory for the job. And then I have to think about myself with my disabilities, is whether I am qualified to be able to do that. I just think that that's a really good point, making sure that we all look at that before we jump to the conclusion that it's because of our disability that somebody doesn't want us, that
Right.
sure that we are
Qualified to do the job. And, you know, and I haven't said this because we're about to jump into the whole concept of reasonable accommodation and what that is. But, you know, that reasonable accommodation figures into the definition of qualified too, because, you know, the ADA talks about being qualified to perform the essential functions of the position with or without a reasonable accommodation. That phrase, with or without a reasonable accommodation. So we're going to talk about that in a minute. But before that, let me talk a little bit more about disclosing and not disclosing. And maybe some people in the audience might have some questions about disclosure that we can talk about a little bit later on, because I want to cover reasonable accommodation first. So if we look at slide number 11, the consequences for not disclosing. So, you know, whenever anybody thinks about talking about their disability with the employer, they have to think of the pros and cons. And so here are some cons for, you know, not disclosing, and that could be, excuse me, not performing at your best. You might fall behind on your workload, particularly if you received accommodations under your IEP in school, and then you go to the workplace and you really struggle because you're not receiving any accommodations. And then you also have the increased stress of not using accommodations you had become accustomed to or need. So, because you're not entitled to accommodations if you don't disclose your disability. So, you know, that's definitely something to think about for people who are thinking about whether they should disclose and request an accommodation. Slide 12, if you do decide to disclose, you don't have to go into a lot of detail about your disability. You just have to disclose that you have a disability, that you need an accommodation, and then talk about how your disability affects your ability to perform the job. You also want to talk about what accommodations have worked in the past and give the employer suggestions about what accommodations might work now. So a lot of times people make the mistake of providing way too much information, way too much. The employer doesn't really, the only reason the employer needs to know you have a disability is because then that means that they know that means that they need to explore accommodations with you and in this interactive process. So then the only information they need is that you have a disability and that you need an accommodation and how your disability affects how you perform. That's all that's relevant for them. They don't need to know the details of how you found out that you have a disability, etc. So in slide 13, you really only need to disclose enough to justify the accommodation. You don't, if you have more than one disability, you don't have to disclose all of your disabilities, particularly any disabilities that aren't relevant to the accommodations. And, you know, again, only to the extent that accommodation is needed. Slide 14, knowing what accommodations you need. And this is something that parents, teachers, transitioning youth, support staff that work with transitioning youth can do right this minute is talk to youth, or if you are a transitioning youth, look at what accommodations have worked in the past for you and determine what other procedures or devices that might be of assistance to you, and be able to talk about how the suggested accommodation can help you in your job. So it's not just a question of saying, I need to have this particular device. You have to give a reason why you need it. Explain how does it help with your, how does it help you know, compensate for the limitations imposed by your disability. And of course, that leads right into the magical question, what is a reasonable accommodation? Which is on slide number 15. One of the best resources that there is on accommodations is the Job Accommodation Network. Have you ever called Jan, Vicki? Oh, you're on mute, you're on mute.
Sorry, no, I have actually not, but I'm going to, because
Yeah, oh no, it is, Jan is a fabulous, fabulous resource. And if you go to askjan.org, they have a database of thousands and thousands of accommodations. They've been around as long as the ADA has, so over 30 years. And they have collected tons of information about different accommodations that work with different disabilities. And so, because a lot of times what happens is youth who are leaving secondary school, they start transitioning out and they say, well, I don't know what's going to work for me in the workplace, you know? And sometimes the only way to find out is to experiment and to try things out. And that's where you can use Job Accommodation Network. So, and spend some time on their website, Vicki, which can take you into a dark hole of different accommodations. Well, it's fascinating. It's really fascinating. And there is nothing that they haven't heard there in terms of this is the, because you can call them with specific jobs and the disability, and they can help you determine what would be some possibilities of accommodations. So they're a great resource. So the definition of a accommodation is a modification, adjustment, allowance, or provision that facilitates an equal employment opportunity for a worker with a disability. And accommodations come into play in applying for a job. You might need an accommodation in the application process. You might need it while you're performing the essential functions of the job or accessing the benefits and privileges of employment. And we'll get into some examples in a second. But I want to revisit something that I said earlier. Remember, I said that ADA is civil rights law, and that the ADA sets forth concepts that help to teach all of us how to include people with disabilities. Well, reasonable accommodation is a fundamental concept of this law. So understanding what the law is talking about when you hear that term reasonable accommodation is really important, because this is the concept that helps us include people with disabilities in employment and level the playing field.
So do employees, do they have to provide accommodations?
Employers have to provide reasonable accommodation to qualified people with disabilities, qualified employees and applicants with disabilities. And that's why you notice how I'm emphasizing words here. You have to be qualified to be entitled to an accommodation. But yes, all employers with 15 or more employees must provide accommodations. And if the ADA covers employers with 15 or more employees, but frequently state laws cover those with less than 15 employees. So, so it's a pretty common concept, and a critical one. And my next slide kind of illustrates that. So this is the difference between equality and equity. And if you look at my little pictures here of these people watching a game from behind a fence, the picture on the left shows everybody getting something equal. This is equal. They all got the same thing. And you can see two people can see, but this person over here in the wheelchair is left out because that box does him or her no good. The picture on the right is an illustration of equity. And the ADA is putting forth concepts like reasonable accommodation in order to provide equity for people with disabilities. This is when people with disabilities get what they need in order to be able to participate. And that might be an accommodation in the workplace, or a service or support or assistance to be able to watch a game. So that's equal versus equity here. And that was so helpful for me when I saw that picture. I'm a visual learner, and it made so much sense because this is, in order to provide an equal opportunity to participate in everything in American life, you have to provide equity. And so these concepts are helping define equity. Is this ringing true? See, you're my person who's making sure that I'm not going off on some tangent here, Vicki.
No, that absolutely, I loved, even Connie said she loves the illustration. It absolutely, that illustration actually provides people with, I think it should be out everywhere for everybody to see.
I agree, because it just, this is, and you know, I understand, because it's hard to define sometimes, especially for people who are not, maybe haven't been exposed to a lot of different people with disabilities, or not working in the field and stuff, and just, you know, may not have an understanding that civil rights for people with disabilities, it isn't as simple as black and white. And so many people get frustrated by that because they all want black and white. They want, this is a disability, this is not a disability. And anybody who is familiar with disability understands that that's just not the way it works. Each individual with a disability is an individual with a disability. And no two disabilities even, you know, are necessarily manifesting itself in the person in the same way. And so it's really hard to, you have to apply each situation differently. So if you have a situation with a particular person with a disability, and that's what we do on our technical assistance line, we talk through individual situations so we can help you apply the law to your individual situation. And, you know, the other thing that can be hard for people sometimes is you can have the same situation and talk it through and apply, and you might come up with different answers. But fortunately, we've had 30 years of legal precedents and cases and guidance from our federal partners. And we have a really good idea of what these concepts mean and how they're applied. So and here are some examples of reasonable accommodations: schedule adjustments or time off, assistive technologies, making facilities accessible, exchanging out marginal job tasks, adjustments in the work environment, adjustments in communication or supervisory methods, that's a common one, and sometimes reassignment to vacant job. There are as many accommodations as there are, you know, different job situations. So as you said before, and you asked us, do employers always have to provide accommodation for employees with disabilities? Now, this is worded a little differently. Employers don't always have to provide accommodation to employees with disabilities. And they don't have to provide accommodations if it would be an undue hardship for the employer. And I will, I'm slowly getting to my slide on undue hardship. What is a reasonable accommodation? What is not a reasonable accommodation? You don't have to eliminate any essential functions of the job. You don't have to lower production standards. You don't have to provide personal items. You don't have to provide indefinite leave, and you don't have to allow a direct threat. So all of these things are, you know, do not equal reasonable accommodation. Now, I use the term undue hardship, which means significant difficulty or expense. And you see a picture of 4 bears going over a waterfall, which is my illustration of undue hardship. It means significant difficulty or expense resulting from the provision of an accommodation, including any accommodations that would be unduly costly, expensive, substantial, disruptive, or that would fundamentally alter the nature of the operation of the covered entity. So, you know, it's very hard to, for employers, this is a really high standard, but, you know, when you have small grocery store chains with fewer employees and stuff, and an employee might be asking for a very, very expensive accommodation, depending on the whole income of the entire business, there might be some situations where there'd be an undue hardship. Now, I will tell you, Vicki, a lot of people don't know that sometimes, now it was only a moment of time before my cat decided he needed to make an appearance.
Always.
He likes to be the center of attention. You know, if you work for a state or local government or a huge employer like Booz Allen or a corporate employer or any employer that's, you know, has, you know, hundreds and hundreds of employees, it is very hard for them to claim undue hardship because when undue hardship is taken into consideration, the courts look at the income of the entire organization. So for a local government, it's not the budget allocation for that particular department that the employee is in. It's looking at the budget of the entire local government or the entire state government. So you can see how hard it would be for government employees to, you know, governments to claim undue hardship. And quite honestly, it hasn't come up as much as it was anticipated when the ADA first passed. Okay, earlier I said that reasonable accommodation is a process. And the law says that employers must provide reasonable accommodation for qualified employees with a disability. And what that looks like is that there's a process to determine what is reasonable accommodation. And what starts that process is the individual making a request, the individual asking for support or assistance. And as the slide says, and there's a picture of Wile E. Coyote holding up a sign that says help, the formal request or specific language is not necessary, but the individual must let the employer know he needs something from the employer because of a disability or health condition. And some people might have questions about this, but you don't have to say, I want a reasonable accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act. But you might say, I am requesting some assistance with my job because of my medical condition. And then that process starts. And the minute you say those words, because you've got to give the employer an opportunity to understand that you're talking about the ADA now, and that because they know, most of the employers know they have obligations under the law. And sometimes it's simple. Most of the time it's simple. Many requests for accommodations come from workers with known or obvious disabilities who ask for simple, common sense things, and such requests are often quickly and easily implemented. What do you think the most common reasonable accommodation requested is, Vicki? What would you guess?
Most reasonable,
Or most common?
common.
Yes, most popular accommodation.
Well, I would think that it would be access to the building where they're going to be working.
Physical access. Well, fortunately, a lot of the buildings are accessible now, but the most popular accommodation requested by people with disabilities is a flexible schedule.
I love that.
What is the most common accommodation requested by people without disabilities?
Same thing.
Exactly the same thing. Exactly the same thing. But again, different situation. And then some situations, most are simple, very, very simple. Most cost less than $500. Gosh, when the ADA was working its way through, and when the ADA passed, everybody thought this was going to be such a big deal. Everybody did. I did so much training on reasonable accommodation in the first couple of years after the ADA passed. And it turned out, yes, this process is, it is a big deal. However, this whole fear about accommodations being so expensive really was never realized. There are accommodations that are expensive. I'm not saying there aren't, but most of them are not and can be provided pretty easily. Now, in some situations, employers can require documentation from a qualified professional in order to verify disability and the need for accommodation, unless both things are obvious. And that includes during the pre-offer stage, if an applicant requests accommodation for the job application process, the pre-offer tests, etc. So there are situations where an employer can ask for documentation, particularly if the disability is not apparent. You know, again, they want as much information so they can ensure that they're providing the correct accommodation. And this all happens during that interactive process, which is called an interactive process for a reason, because it needs to be interactive between the two people. And if you look at slide 23, you see, here's a picture of the interactive process. Well, the picture's next. Here are the obligations of the interactive process. So we have the employer who reviews the request, asks for medical documentation if it's necessary, determines if the person has a disability or not, They investigate lots of different options if that's appropriate, and they get to decide on the option and implement it and then monitor it. The applicant or employee with the disability, they make the request, they set this whole process in motion, they provide documentation if it's necessary, they offer examples of accommodations and ideas that may work for them because they know best. And then they implement the accommodation that is decided on, and they revisit if it's necessary. And if we look at a picture of that process, we have slide 24, it says interact, communicate, collaborate. And again, it's an interactive process. So we see a little square with employee, the square with workplace manager, a square with assistive technology specialist, a square with accessibility consultant, and rehab professionals as all the potential people that can be involved in the process, going back and forth with the employer or the decision maker. Now, usually, Vicki, it's just the employee and the manager, but sometimes the job coach can be involved, all of these people, depending on what kind of accommodation is needed.
Wow.
And I'll breathe here for a minute and see if any questions have occurred to you.
So it's so much information.
I know, it really is. It really
I have a
is.
question.
Sure.
Okay.
So my question is around, this whole process, right? It's initiated by the employee. So how do we empower our disabled employees to advocate for themselves? Because I'm sure in the past, there's been a lot of negative experiences in asking for accommodation. So how do we encourage self-advocacy?
That's a great, wonderful question, Connie, and I have some tools to help that too. Ideally, that students, when they're still in secondary school, are learning how to advocate for themselves. And that's why it's so important. Self-advocacy is such an important skill to learn as young as possible. And parents can be good role models, and we all can be good role models for each other. But first of all, people with disabilities have to know about the ADA and that it exists. And then they have to know how it applies to them specifically. So they have to have somebody sit down with them and say, listen, you're entitled to accommodations under the law, just like you had under your IEP, but it's going to be different in the workplace. So let's look at this job and see what accommodations might be helpful. Well, sometimes the young adult might say, well, no, I'm not going to talk about my disability. I don't want to request accommodation, which is fine. Again, the choice is always the individuals. They are autonomous here. They have that choice. However, we talked about the consequences of not disclosing, just like we all did when we went on our first jobs, you have to try things out to see what works and what doesn't work. So that means going on the job, trying it out, see if you can do it without an accommodation if you're not comfortable requesting one. And then if you struggle, revisiting the option of requesting accommodation. Because Connie, what happens is a lot of students leave secondary school and they want nothing more to do with special education. They don't get that when they leave secondary school, they leave special education behind. There is no special education, after they leave secondary school. And employers, again, it's not the focus of attention. It's in their best interest to get what they need to be successful in the job, including accommodations if they can. So they need to know their choices so they can decide the best way to advocate for themselves, which may or may not include requesting an accommodation. And then if they decide to do that, they have to have some idea about what works for them and what doesn't. Does that make sense? Oh, Connie.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense to me. And, I worked in a university setting for many years, and a lot of students wouldn't disclose their disability and then had a miserable kind of year and would come up against academic review. And at that time, it was disclosed, well, I have this. And so then there was mediation and other opportunities. But I will say that the shame factor, is something that we need to change.
Yes.
That you shouldn't feel ashamed that you have a disability. You should feel proud about your disability, and that you do. We all need help. It just comes in a variety of different ways.
Exactly. And I think, I hope that the stigma and the shame is starting to be addressed by more and more people, including really famous people, talking about their struggles with disability and owning that, yes, we all have our strengths and weaknesses, and again, it's in your best interest to be able to advocate for yourself and to make those decisions. And it's been 31 years, and I would have hoped that we were farther than we are, but again, we continue to work to help. And my feeling has always been, give everyone the information and then let them decide, and then let them see the results, and then be able to go back and look like, okay, when I requested accommodation, we did a study, the ADA Center did a study, and we found that young adults, transitioning youth, were much more able to request accommodations in a university setting, and much more able and willing to do that than they were in the employment setting. And I thought that was really interesting.
That's really interesting. And I think of, like one of the biggest names out there right now, Naomi Osaka, who, pulled out of several tennis tournaments because she was claiming her disability, and she didn't want to speak to the media because it created such anxiety. And I think that's a beautiful role model of you're at the top of your game, and you're like, no, I'm not gonna put myself in jeopardy, my mental health in jeopardy.
Right. Yes, you're exactly right, Connie. I'm glad you brought that up. That was such a beautiful example. I mean, I'm sorry for Naomi for her struggles, but how gutsy was it for her to stand up and say what she said and own it? I mean, just really own it. So a lot of us struggle with depression, and those of us who've had experience with depression completely understand, well, we can't empathize because we've never been in front of a press corps before, but we can see that how daunting that would be for her. And I thought that was a great example and a great way to show self-advocacy. Okay, we're moving along here. We talk a lot about customized employment. As I said, Transcend, the organization that the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center is part of, is all about meaningful work and community inclusion for people with disabilities. And we do a lot of customized employment training. And I like to talk to the president of the organization, Laura Owens, because she's an expert in customized employment. And we have great conversations about where does customized employment fit in the whole scheme of reasonable accommodation. And customized employment is a different employment situation. It is kind of, if you look at accommodations, reasonable accommodations as a continuum, customized employment is one end of the continuum. I'm sorry, Connie, were you going to say something?
Nope.
Okay,
No.
okay. I think, with customized employment, there's a voluntarily disclosure of disabilities. You're focusing on skills versus deficits. You're not having an individual necessarily compete against others for a job, but you're looking at how somebody with a significant disabilities can contribute in a particular job situation. So there's a voluntarily negotiation of the customized job description. So, which is otherwise known as job restructuring. And everything hinges on the relationship with the employer. So the situations where a customized employment has been successfully implemented, it's really all about the relationship with the employer and the employer being able to interact and believe that there is a place for that everybody, regardless of disability, has a contribution to make in the workplace. And in order to see sometimes how people with the most significant disabilities can contribute, you have to look at, okay, what contribution can they make? What needs to be done? And then how can we customize a job so it can be done? And again, this is part of the accommodation process. Now, I would also say, because I talk a lot to employment specialists and job coaches, and I tell them, if you are supporting people with disabilities on jobs and you've been working with employers and developing those relationships with employers for people with disabilities to get into competitive jobs in the community, then the best place to look for customized options, if you have a person that you're working with who might need a customized option, is to look at the existing relationships you have with employers who are already accommodating people with disabilities, because those are employers who already know, they already get it. They know people with disabilities are not new to this whole idea of disability in the workplace, and people with disabilities are just like everybody else and contribute just like everybody else, and they might do things a little bit differently. There's a lot more to, we could do a whole session on customized employment, which is a great topic to talk about, but I always like to include, where does customized employment fit into reasonable accommodation? On slide 26, not wanting to leave education out. Now, we've been talking about Title I, the employment provisions, and qualified people with disabilities being entitled to reasonable accommodation. Under Title II and Title III, people with disabilities are entitled to equal opportunities for education, just like everybody else. So institutes of higher ed, post-secondary institutions, have non-discrimination requirements under the law as well. They must make modifications to policies, practices, and procedures in order to include people with disabilities. They must provide auxiliary aids and services for effective communications, and this might mean sign language interpreters, like we have here today, assistive listening devices, materials in accessible formats. So there are ADA requirements for post-secondary education institutions. They are accommodating qualified students with disabilities too. I just didn't want to leave because transitioning to post-secondary education is part of the transition process. So we never want to leave them out, but I really wanted to focus on employment today.
Mhm.
So as was illustrated in my picture of the three people watching the game, accommodation should assure equal opportunities, not guarantee success. So again, the ADA is civil rights law that give people with disabilities an equal opportunity to participate in society. It's not a guarantee of success. Okay, So communications are the key to accommodations, and now we're transitioning, wow, time is flying, Vicki, wow, to some tools and additional resources to help, and what can you do at the transition stage in order to support students with disabilities who are transitioning. Students and employees must disclose disability and request accommodations. Documentation of disability may be needed and or if the disability and or the need is not obvious. So documentation isn't necessarily requested all the time, but can be if the need is not obvious. Okay, so what do parents of transitioning youth need to know about the ADA? And what difference can they make? And this is what you've been waiting for, Vicki. Parents' role is, number one, support, and that doesn't change over time. But parents can help identify accommodations that their son or daughter might be able to use at different jobs in the workplace, because it really is an exploration process. And that whole idea of career exploration and what do I want to do with my life? What kind of career do I want? You want to be able to identify different accommodations that might be helpful in different environments. As a parent, you can have practice conversations, especially when it comes to disclosing disability to employers and practicing not giving too much information. And you can be the promoter of independence, and this is probably the hardest role, I know it was for me with my children, is to really promote that autonomy and giving your son or daughter the choice, even though as mom or dad, you may know, or you may think you know what is best. You really want the choice to be because how else are they going to learn? How else are they going to learn? And what's so hard about this, Vicki, is, and I'm sure you can relate, is as parents, we've been advocating for our son or daughter their whole education, advocating to get them in special education in their IEP, advocating to get the right program in school for them, the right accommodations, advocating to get the teacher to support the son or daughter properly. So all of a sudden, we have to step back and we really have to help our son or daughter do what we've been doing for them all along. Does that ring true?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. With my son who had an IEP at first grade, it was constantly the goal is to make them make it so that they know to ask for them, that there's no reason why they can't do it. But again, all you could do is really support them, let them know that there are things out there that they are entitled to, but also leaving it up to them on whether they want to disclose it. Very quickly, my son graduated from high school, wanted to go to tech school to be an auto mechanic. Unfortunately, the auto mechanic school, nothing in the advertisements, in the paperwork or any of that he received talked about, accommodations and things like that. So he decided not to disclose any of it to see if he could get, when he applied. And it came down to, we during we went in to see the school, and at that point in time, my son said something about accommodations, and unfortunately the school said that they don't make them for anyone at that point in time. And that really scarred my son on like the whole, like he decided not to go to school at that point in time, that it was going to be too much of a hassle. And I think it's a shame that we still, at that point in time, and he is 30 now, so things have changed, thank goodness. But it's still, it's like, we can bring our children there, but they need to say something. And it became this huge discussion that day with all of these parents at this school.
Yeah, and I mean, that's the hardest, is that when, you know, when your son decides he's finally going to say something, and then to be met with rejection is just, you hope that that's not going to happen. But, you know, unfortunately, sometimes that still does, even when they're wrong. I mean, obviously they can't say they're not going to make accommodations, and, you know, what's the situation? But the person he was probably talking to probably had no idea and didn't know anything about the ADA and didn't know what the requirement is. And so then, of course, it's like, you just want to argue, and yeah, what are you doing? And you want to get into it. And it's like, and he's done. He's just like, I don't even want to deal with it. And
Absolutely.
and it's so, I mean, that's where it's really hard as a parent, because you have to decide which way you're going to go. And
Right. So I was very good, and I tried to keep my mouth shut as much as possible during it, because he made his decision. And that's just kind of the way that it was going to be. You don't change my son's mind. So, but I did go, and I did write a letter, and I did have a conversation with that school.
well, good. I mean, good, because at least then it makes a difference for the next person, hopefully.
Yes. Well, that was, you know, and I went through and I was like, you have to understand that you have a child who's been in an IEP, has an IEP since first grade, who like going to a regular 4-year university, book learning, all of that was not something that excited him. The fact that he was excited that he could go to a trade school was huge. And it was, I know with the parents and things that I've been around with other children with IEPs, like, it was a huge deal. And I was like, you just like sucked the life out of them. And I'm like, you have to do better.
Yeah, for the people who come after
Yes.
after your son. So yeah, it's tough. And again, I think knowing, for parents, knowing that you're going through a transition as well, that you're transitioning to more of a backseat role, and you still can be a promoter of independence, you can still be a fierce advocate, but your focus is helping your son or daughter do it themselves and get as independent as possible. So, and on slide 31, we did a research study of 42 youth with a variety of different disabilities in 3 different states, and talking to them about their employment experiences. And we were trying to identify the barriers and the facilitators to employment, what was helpful and what wasn't. And what was so interesting is the 42 youth that we talked to were across the spectrum of age. So I think the youngest was 15 and the oldest was 22. And every disability was represented. And, you know, 5 themes emerged, which you can imagine. A lot didn't want to disclose because of the stigma associated with their disability. The ones who did choose to disclose and requested accommodations immediately saw the difference that accommodations made a difference for them. And the ones that chose not to disclose and talk about their disability really had a huge amount of anxiety. And this wasn't anxiety in the context of disability. This was anxiety on the job because I'm keeping my disability private, and I'm afraid that I'm going to get messed up, or I'm afraid I'm going to be discriminated against if I talk about it. And I'm just concerned about what other people are going to think, etc. And the other thing that was super disappointing was how few of the youth knew that they had heard of the ADA, but they had no idea what it said and that they were entitled to accommodations. What was interesting, Vicki, is a great majority of them could talk about their disability in a very articulate, educated way and talk about their disability, how it affected their performance in school. But, you know, a lot of them, it was the first time they were hearing about their right to accommodations on the job. And so that told me we've got a lot more work to do in educating youth while they're still in secondary school.
Absolutely.
So I brought forward some transition tools, and I think we have a couple of them that are uploaded, but some of the ways, getting back to Connie's question earlier, how can we help transitioning youth become good self-advocates? Make good use of the IEP. It's there, it's required by law, so we might as well make good use of it in school as a self-advocacy tool. So let's go through the IEP and figure out what information might be helpful after secondary school. Present level of performance, the transition plan, accommodations page, what accommodations have been helpful, what are the goals, you know, is this going to be of any use after? So look at it as a document in that way. You can also use it, I do a whole nother workshop on participation in your IEP process too, which I love to talk about as well. But so using the IEP process, enlisting help of all the teachers, talking to the teachers, ensuring that they understand about the ADA and how it applies. And you want to start small and think intuitively, what makes the most sense? Like one of the most common sense self-advocacy skills is the ability to ask for help. Do you know how to ask for help? Can you ask for help when you need it? That's huge. And that's a self-advocacy skill. So start there. And families are partners in the process. And getting, you know, I worked for 10 years, I worked for a school system in the area of transition. And I did a lot of focus of my work was teaching self-advocacy skills. And, you know, there's a lot of wonderful curriculum in the schools about teaching self-advocacy skills. But a lot of times when I would talk to teachers about this, they would say, I don't have time to teach it. I don't have time for a separate curriculum. And they're right, they didn't have time for a separate curriculum. However, they can be promoters, just like families can be promoters of self-advocacy skills by offering different options for, you know, okay, you're gonna get these 4 chores done. You get to decide what order you're gonna do them in, and as long as they're all 4 completed by the end of the day today, and when you're gonna do them. And so, you know, and then giving choice there. And teachers can give students choices in the classroom as well, within different assignments too, to promote self-advocacy skills and talk about it in the IEP. As families, you bring it up. I want my son or daughter to be a better self-advocate. What can you do to help me in this process? And try and partner with schools, although I know that's not always an easy thing to do, but it's you know, if you're both singing from the same choir book, it's really helpful. So 2 handouts, which I have, and are they available on the website, Vicki? On the, oh, I'm sorry, you're muted.
Yes, they are.
Okay.
Both are downloadable from the website. If you click on the discussion today, those links are right there for you.
Great. One is making choices, getting ready. This is a self-rating checklist to prepare a person with a disability for a disability-related conversation with an employer or potential employer. and it addresses the legal, practical, and human aspects of the conversation. So it's just a good, I love checklists. It's just a really helpful checklist to see as an assessment to see if you're ready to have that conversation. The next handout on page 36 is the disclosure decision worksheet. And this is a tool for working through different disclosure options. You know, if yes, I decide to disclose, what exactly you are to disclose, when are you going to do it, and walks you through all those options. What happens if you choose not to disclose, etc. And there's a flow chart format and to cover all the bases, and it can be used multiple times. Slide 37. How can we use these tools we can use them in the classroom. So giving these tools to teachers who don't have them, because my experience in talking to teachers and families is that teachers are really eager for any tools, any checklist, anything that that will help and complement to prepare the student for life after school. So putting those to use in the classroom, at home, working through the checklist, having those discussions, and certainly in the community as well. I mean, these are places you can use them. Honestly, there's so much more to talk about here. I hope this is the beginning of our discussion. And before I kind of wrap things up, Vicki, I know we have a little bit more time, so I wanted to see if you had any questions, or if there are any questions from the audience.
Sure. So first, I just put links to the Google Drive that has the pieces that you can print out, the worksheets that you just talked about, so that they
good. Okay, great.
chat for you. Also, thank you so much for this. This is great information. This is one of the things that I am working on my, like I always tell people, with my second hat as working with disability equality in education.
Yeah.
One of the big things that we're doing is we're trying to introduce disability into the general curriculum throughout the PA curriculum.
Good.
And some of those things are like starting to talk to administrators and teachers and the guidance counselors, I guess that's what we call them, on how to be more helpful to a student with disabilities. But then, and also adding some advocacy into some of the conversations that already go on throughout of these conversations that are happening around politics and government and things like that in schools, in your regular classrooms, not in a special disability class.
Right.
That is not the point. But broaching these subjects as part of that. One of the greatest things that happened with me this spring was I was invited by the Frere Charter School here in Center City to speak to 4 classes they were 5th through 7th graders. And we talked about disability advocacy, how, students with disabilities. And we talked about just a little disability etiquette, because I find that that's very helpful. And then it was amazing to hear these young folks speak up. And it's like, I have a disability. I didn't know that I could get that.
No.
Like, some of them had no idea what an IEP was, or that there actually was something like that, because there are still so many there are still so many students who don't disclose that they have an IEP.
Right.
So, I'm like, so how does like your friend who might need one know that there actually is one if nobody in her family doesn't know, she didn't know. So it's like, how do we get those, how do we patch those holes?
Right.
To make sure that we all are aware of all of these things.
Right. And destigmatize the conversation.
Yes, and that's kind of, that's our role at Disability Equality and Education, you know, is bringing these kind of conversations in, but also bringing in, like, making sure, like, that of course the social studies classes are about the disability civil rights movement, along with other disability rights, other civil rights movements, and also just using some of the using some disability language within some of their other classrooms, so that way it is ending the stigma, is actually starting to more people will talk about disability in better ways and in better situations, and also freeing those of us with disabilities to not feel afraid to actually talk to people about their disability. And I think that whole, like, we have to bring everybody in. It's got to be the parents, it needs to be the students, it needs to be the administrators, it needs to be the college folks.
Right.
It needs to be the job folks,
Yeah, my biggest issue is a lot of these people don't know what they don't know. And that's why these efforts are so important, because if one person who is listening today can bring information to another person to tell, it's kind of like the Breck commercial from years ago. People of a certain age will remember, and you tell two friends and they tell two friends. And
absolutely,
that's really what it is, because we get so mad because we're not as far as we want it to be, but then there's so many people who still don't have the information they need. And that's why it's so important, what we do is so important to get that information out there. And that's why Disability Pride Pennsylvania is so critical, because it's a great opportunity to get the word out in so many different areas, really.
Yeah, I mean, it's I like I was telling everybody at opening ceremonies, Disability Pride is, I wanted there to be a place where people can have fun, but you can have fun but still have important conversations, tough talks, and needed information, because there is, even in the disability community, there's still misinformation. And that's one of the things this year that I'm trying to dedicate to, is making sure people are getting the right information. So that way when we're sending it out, when we're saying it in other areas, and we're saying it to other people in different groups, that we're giving them the right information.
Right.
And that's why I'm so thankful that you came and spoke with us. And that's why I thought it was very important that we had this conversation as the first event to kick off all the rest of the events for the weeks.
Well, I'm so honored, Vicki. Seriously, I think that's great. And, I think everybody needs to know that now we are the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center, and we serve the great state of Pennsylvania. So you can see on the map, we are Region 3, but there are 10 regional centers across the country. So those of you who have colleagues in other areas of the country, and if you dial our 800 number, the 1-800-949-4232, you will get hooked into the center that serves the area code you're calling from. And as I said, we're the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center, so anybody can reach out to us, and we will happily answer questions about the ADA and how it applies to your situation. That's what we do. We have information specialists who do that. We do a lot of training. You and I will be doing things in the future, which I'm very excited about. And yeah, it's I think We are a good, unfortunately, underutilized resource. And here's my contact information if anybody would like to reach out to me directly at Transcend. It's a.deschamps@transcend.org. And Vicki can also put you in touch with me. We do have, I'll just do a little ad, we do have on-demand and live webinars, and because we finally have a learning management system. And if you go to our website at transcend.org, you can get connected to our learning management system. And this is my favorite slide because this is my puppy, Gracie, who is a beagle mix. And so I want to encourage people to reach out to us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. And we would love to hear from you. But I'm not sure if there anything else we want to say before we're done. Yes, Connie.
Well, there was a question in the chat a bit ago, but I think it's worth bringing up. You used the word non-apparent disability, and one of the participants asked, how do you feel about the word invisible disability?
That's a really great question. I don't know. My first reaction is it kind of is like you're hiding something, but invisible is just something you can't see, like the invisibility cloak. So, I think invisible is I think invisible makes sense because you can't see it. So you don't know, other people don't know it's there. So my response is I would use it.
I use the word invisible disability because it's not saying that we are invisible, it's just that our disability is invisible.
But it's still there,
Correct.
Yeah.
Right.
I think Rich had a question too.
Hi, Rich.
Hello. Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And this was great. And I am a career coach who, after 60 years, decided to come up with a name for myself because I didn't like the other names that had been used over the past 60 years. They were awful, some of them. And so I came up with the word QUID, which is a qualified individual with an invisible disability.
I like that. I like it.
Thank you. So yeah, I'm doing some innovative things, and I'm happy to talk after the event, with anyone. It's a Comfort Career Connections is the company I have, but the whole topic of disclosure, identification, the companies that today really are trying to identify individuals with disabilities, and then they can't, and then the other companies who have these amazing disability diversity initiatives internally, and unfortunately the stigma is very strong still, and people are hesitant to disclose. It really is a very individual decision. I would agree with exactly what you were saying, and starting in the schools is vital. I do have a quick question though, Anne. Do you feel that with WIOA and the mandate for vocational rehabilitation to get into the high schools, at least at the high school level, there has been an impact, positive impact on students?
I'm glad you asked that. I think that's a great question. I think it depends. At Transcend, we do a lot of work with different state vocational rehabilitation programs, and just like any other program, depending on where you are, it's the quality of the program. I mean, it really, I'm telling you, it really hinges on the relationship between the state vocational rehabilitation program and the school system. And if there's a positive relationship there, the students will benefit. And if there isn't, and there's divisiveness, then they won't. And so I think it depends on the state program, and then it depends. I know because I'm familiar in some of the different states we cover. And I know in Maryland, they're divided up into regions and they vary by regions. But I think I was very excited when as somebody who's been in transition and the ADA my whole career, to see those requirements get put into place. And I think like with any new requirement, it's going to take a long time to establish what it's supposed to look like. And then hopefully we'll see great examples across the country of state vocational rehabilitation programs partnering well with school system to implement transition programs, because they're supposed to complement each other, not, overlap, not necessarily do the same service. So isn't that great for the students? But at the same time, too many cooks spoil the broth. And if you've got all these people running all over trying to address transition and the right hand doesn't know what the left hand's doing, that can cause some chaos sometimes too. So I think it's going to be, I think the legislation had the exact right intent, and I think it can potentially be amazing. And I've heard of some great pre-employment transition service programs around the country that are working successfully in helping students. But I think it really depends on where you are. And, there's a lot of education that needs to happen, because just because you know the word transition doesn't mean you necessarily understand what these transition services are.
Absolutely.
That's
Thank
great.
you very much.
I just had one other question as you were talking about disclosure. And you were very general in how you disclose, but do you recommend that people do a verbal and written disclosure?
That's a really good question, Connie. I think it depends on the circumstance. I think I always think that, especially when you're asking for something important, verbal and in writing is a good idea. But I also think practicing those discussions are really important, because I think there's a fine line that a person can walk, because this is really not a big deal in the majority of cases. So you don't want to go overboard in the explanation. However, you are self-advocating and you are saying, I need a change in my job. Because of my, my learning disability, or whatever you decide to say. And this is the reason. I mean, you want to be really clear that you're in ADA land and that you're talking about it. And I'm happy to put it in writing. In fact, I put it in writing right here. And here is a letter that's requesting this. So you're very clear, because again, you don't want to keep the employer guessing either. You want the communication. I would say a huge percentage of the court cases that involve reasonable accommodation come about because of breakdown of communication between the person with the disability and the employer. Somebody stops communicating. And that's why that process, that interactive process, is so important. It's so important.
Thank you. That was a great answer. And I really appreciate all the work that you do. And as we continue to erase stigma and break down barriers together, thank you so much for your work. If there are no other questions in the chat, I think we'll close this session. So I'm just gonna take a quick look to see if it doesn't. Okay. So Anne, thank you very much for being our first kickoff
I'm so honored.
session today.
I
And
am.
I just want to welcome everyone to turn on their cameras, to wave goodbye and thank Anne for the session. It's really nice to see faces before we leave.
Absolutely. Thank you, Anne. I'm so excited about the work that we're going to do together, and I've already got my paperwork done so that I can be a part of your ADA training that hopefully starts soon.
Oh, yes, yeah, and I do want to get that word of thank you for reminding me. If I could just take a second, what Vicki is referring to is that we have a initiative called the ADA Trainer Leadership Network, and we have quite a big contingent from Pennsylvania involved in the ADA Trainer Leadership Network. And if you are interested in becoming part of the ADA Trainer Leadership Network, the qualifications really are that you do presentations as part of your job or as part of something that you do for, so Rich, you obviously do presentations as part of your job, and that you are interested in the ADA and want to provide good, accurate information for the people that you're talking to, because it's a network of trainers that we train to provide basic ADA training and disability awareness training to employers, to people with disabilities, to state, local governments, to any audience that is interested. And once you apply to be part of the network, you participate in a day-and-a-half training that introduces you to a 50 module curriculum that really is the training that you can then take and present to other people. It's a great program that's been going on since 2014. We have a huge contingent from Pennsylvania. And if you are interested, please reach out to me or Vicki. Vicki has the application and the information, and she can send that to you. I can also send that to you and provide more information and talk through if you're not sure whether it would be a good match. I'd be happy to have a conversation with you about that. But we're trying to get a big enough group together so either I can come in person now that we're sort of coming out of the pandemic, or we can do a virtual training to train more leaders. So.
Okay. Thanks for letting me know about that.
Yeah, well, thank you for the reminder, Vicki. I can't believe I got so caught up in what we were talking about. I completely forgot.
I've been telling people for days.
Oh, good. Well, see, I just need to tell Vicki and then everybody will know.
Hi, Kathy.
Hi there, how are you doing? It's a great session, truly great. Thank you for it.
Oh, it's so nice to see you.
Yes, you too.
It's been too long.
I hear my daughter was on this morning and I missed her. I had to find out through email from other people.
Yes, Alexa was amazing. She
never tells me.
She was very nervous, but she did really great.
Good.
I was very excited to hear from, one of the things I tried to do was to invite folks from different parts of the state, because we are virtual PA, to have a say. So it was very exciting to have her speak.
Great, thank you. I'll let her know you said that.
So I think we're, anybody else have any questions? I think that we are all done. I can't see any of the questions at the moment. Any other questions? So I think what we're going to do is we're going to wrap this up for today. Thank you again, Anne, for everything. Hold on. Hi, Chris.
You
You have a
feel
question for us?
like doing that
How would they feel like doing what? What in specific?
Being together.
Oh, like in person.
Yeah.
Okay.
We will soon be together, I promise. We are just trying to make sure that we're all still being safe. The numbers are getting better. I'm hoping that we'll have some type of live event in late fall, maybe during Disability Action Month. But we will be coming together next year in
I'm
person.
not gonna be here next Friday.
Okay.
Not when you're there, but you'll still be participating.
So if everybody has anything else, you can reach me. My email address is Vicki, VICKI, at disabilitypridephiladelphia.org. Or you can fill out the contact form on our website, which is disabilitypridepa.org. And I will reach out to you or one of my staff.
I just have something to say for
Thank you so much for being part of it. And we hope
I have something to say to her.
to see you at the next one. The next session is tonight. It's live with Gooch and Bree from their porch to yours at 6 o'clock. And thank you to Jay and to Rita Jo for interpreting.